Imagine that you're doing a test where, like in our hypothetical example we were doing, what you're testing is that you're eventually going to call this other service, TMDB, to ask for matches to a list of movies. Right? Now, in the hypothetical test that we were working on, we were only concerned about, does the controller do the right thing? And therefore, we were stubbing out the method that eventually is going to make the call to the real TMDB external service. But if you were doing a cucumber scenario for this, the question is, in that cucumber scenario, do you actually want to call the real external TMDB? Because now you're introducing essentially a dependence on the rest of the internet into your test. Not so good for test independence, right? So if you're going to say, well, OK, what if we can get all the way to where TMDB would be called, but we'll stop there. At that point, we'll put a method stub in. Just like we stub the find in TMDB method itself, we can find some place in the app right before it hits the internet, and we'll do the stubbing there instead. And that's basically the approach that you can take. What we already saw is we stub out the world, right? The find in TMDB method doesn't even get called. That's what we did in the controller test. Sometimes these external services have a gem or a library that wraps the API to the service. So we used to have a Ruby TMDB gem that did this. But to give a real life example, think of something like Stripe, which is a payment processing API that I'm sure you've all heard of. If you look at Stripe's website, the documentation for the Stripe API is it's just a RESTful API. It uses HTTP, GET and POST, all the things you've already learned about. But if you want to use Stripe from a higher level language and framework, like Ruby or Python or JavaScript, they have really nice libraries that shield you from having to deal with actually manipulating the low-level Stripe API components. That you can say something like, Stripe, create a charge for this credit card for this amount of money. And you don't have to worry about what the HTTP route looks like or anything like that. There's a library that deals with all that for you. In those cases, you can stub the library. So here, I have a hypothetical library called TMDB movie that shields you from the low-level aspects of the TMDB API. I can say, when my app tries to call that library, stub that call. And instead, return some canned values, simulating what the TMDB API would return if I really called it. I can probably be a little more compulsive and say, well, even if there's a library, at some point, that library has to use Ruby's functionality for actually using the internet. So I could stub at the level of HTTP. And at this point, basically, what am I testing? Well, if this library is a third-party library, maybe not so useful. But if this is my library, maybe what I want to test is, when I tell the library to go out and do a certain API call, I want to make sure that the library is producing the correct API call, that it's producing the right URI, the params look correct, the HTTP method used is correct. So in those cases, I can actually stub the Ruby library and say, OK, right before you make the HTTP request, stub there. And allow me to see what is the exact thing that would be sent over HTTP to the remote service. And in fact, for some of you, if your projects involve interacting with an external service, there's a Ruby gem called Fake Web that does exactly this. Basically, you can use this gem to return a canned value that looks just like what a real API would return, like the raw JSON format and everything. And then you can test if your app is parsing that properly, should that be of importance to you. So if you're using something like Fake Web, and then finally, the last version of this is, even if you've done all those tests, you probably also want a staging environment, which is where your app is running in an environment that looks just like production, but it's not the one with the real customer's data. In the staging environment, you might actually want to run real live tests that really go out and hit the remote service. Why do you need to do that? Well, because in real life, when you make an API call to a remote service, there are ways that it can fail that are not trivial to reproduce in a control testing environment. For example, if the internet is really, really slow that day and your call times out, you could find a way to simulate that locally, but it's kind of a pain in the butt. Or if the remote server actually is overloaded and it sends you back an error. Again, you could find ways to simulate that, but as a sanity check, you might want to have a real test in your staging environment that interacts with the real remote service. Most remote services that have a lot of clients, like for example Stripe, actually provide a separate version of their service. Sometimes they'll call it a sandbox or a staging service, which has an API that behaves just like the real service in every way, but for example, in Stripe's case, no money changes hands. So instead they say, if you want to simulate a card being declined, for example, use this specific credit card number when you do a post. If you want to simulate a transaction being declined because it's too high, use this specific card number to simulate that. You run those against the staging server, and the mechanics are identical to the real thing, but the effects are not the same, obviously. Okay, so all of which is to say, testing is about isolating behaviors in your app, the things that you're trying to test, from behaviors that are incidental to it, but you need to somehow have those behaviors in play in order for the test to work. And the ultimate example of this is when your app up here depends on a remote service. And where do you do that stubbing? The answer is it depends on what's the thing you're trying to test. So the rule of thumb, I guess, my guideline is I stub as close as I can to the top of the stack for unit tests, right? Because I'm trying to isolate as much as possible. I stub closer to the bottom of the stack for integration testing because I want it to be as realistic as possible. So if I'm really going to call the TMDB database, I'd like to get all the way up to the point right before I call it and make sure that my call looks sane. And that is all stuff that I can do stubbing up here. Maybe in my staging environment, I'll actually have an additional test that calls out to the staging server for TMDB. But in general, stub a lot up here and stub a lot less down here. Same thing. OK, so questions about I think this has sort of been a 2-day whirlwind overview of the main concepts of testing, which is where and how do you create stand-in fake behaviors, whether it's double objects or stubbed method calls, so that your test can just focus on the thing you want, and you can isolate the test from things around it, right? And the higher up you are towards unit tests, the more you're going to be doing that isolation. The further down you are towards integration tests, the less you're going to do it because you want those tests to be realistic. You're testing how the whole thing works together.